For the month of April 2024, we have been doing an examination of a selection of informal logical fallacies. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into the no true Scotsman fallacy on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Over the past several weeks, the no true Scotsman fallacy has come to the attention of the apologetic space. The absurd postmodern ramblings of Dan McClellan have raised questions about the nature of the no true Scotsman fallacy. So we are doing a deep dive into the no true Scotsman fallacy, and like most of our examinations of logical fallacies, we are going to analyze the structure of the argument and if exceptions to it exist. First, let us look at a basic example of the argument and fallacy. Bob starts by stating, "No Scotsman puts sugar on his oatmeal." John replies, "My uncle is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar on his oatmeal." Bob then answers, "But no true Scotsman puts sugar on his oatmeal." Okay, we have here a fairly typical example of the fallacy. Structurally, it's a composite fallacy. That is, the argument is actually two informal fallacies paired together. The argument begins with a fallacy of relevance, such as a non sequitur or red herring. It is then followed by a moving of the goalpost fallacy. Bob's first statement here is a fallacy of relevance. And in these sorts of arguments, any fallacy of relevance could be used. An appeal to authority, appeals to ignorance, it doesn't really matter the kind of initial fallacy used. But here we have a non sequitur. It simply does not follow that being a Scotsman has anything to do with using sugar. Now, when McClellan talks about this fallacy, he says, quote, "The no true Scotsman's fallacy, there has to be a specific progression to the argument. You begin with a generalization." Now, while McClellan is correct that the argument normally begins with a generalization alone does not make the argument fallacious. For this to be fallacious, there has to be an initial error in reasoning. Generalizations can, however, be true and valid. Now, there are fallacies of generalization, but not every generalization is an error or a fallacy. However, for there to be a no true Scotsman fallacy, the first premise has to be a fallacy of relevance. Otherwise, you do not have a fallacious version of the argument. The second component of the argument is a response, here provided by John. John provides what's called in philosophy a counterfactual, a contrary example that negates the initial fallacy of relevance. And then finally, Bob responds to John's counterfactual with a moving the goalpost fallacy. By adding the word true in this particular case, Bob is changing the meaning of Scotsman from one that is a commonly accepted definition of being a Scotsman to one where any Scotsman must also preclude the practice of putting sugar on one's oatmeal. McClellan again states, quote, "Then you have to revise the generalization arbitrarily." And what that means is you change the generalization. And it is a fallacy because it arbitrarily arrogates the prerogative to declare what is real, true, or genuine. However, contrary to McClellan's long-winded suggestion, the addition of the word true or similar adverbs such as real or genuine does not necessarily render the argument fallacious. And that is because everything in the no true Scotsman fallacy is contingent upon the veridical status of the first premise. If the first premise is fallacious, then the final premise makes a definitional change to the first premise through the addition of the words true or genuine. So, in order to be fallacious, the final premise must extend the definition of the first premise beyond its commonplace meaning. In other words, the final premise has to change the parameters of the first claim, or in other words, moving the goalpost. Think of this like an American football game, where the punter tries to kick the ball to the goalpost, but he falls short. So, he moves the goalpost closer and declares that he scored. That is what's happening here with Bob's second premise. But if the first premise is not fallacious, then adding true or real to the third premise does not arbitrarily arrogate or change anything at all with regard to the first premise, but simply reaffirms the parameters set forth in the first premise. In this event, the goalpost is not moved, and the argument is not fallacious. Here is an example of the same argument structure that is valid, similar to the one used by Inspiring Philosophy. George states, "Vegans don't eat meat." Peter replies, "My Uncle Angus is a vegan and he eats steak." George then replies, "But true vegans don't eat meat." So how does this argument differ from argument number one? The difference is that the first premise is not a fallacy of relevance. By definition, a vegan is one who does not eat or use animal products. Meat is an animal product, so it logically follows that vegans don't eat meat. Now, McClellan responds to this argument by claiming that the addition of true is arbitrary and therefore fallacious. Quote, "Just because your conclusion is accurate does not mean your argument cannot be a fallacy. And just because your argument is fallacious does not mean that your conclusion is falsified or wrong. That fundamentally misunderstands the nature of informal fallacies because they are not saying, quote, 'Oh, well, let's take a look at how we can understand that a vegan is how people typically use the word vegan, and you can see that your uncle is not actually a vegan,' end quote. That would be providing an argument. But to respond to my Uncle Angus is a vegan and he eats steak by saying, 'Well, no true vegan eats meat,' is changing the boundaries of the claim arbitrarily by presuming to have the prerogative to dictate the difference between true veganism and false veganism. That's the arbitrariness. That's the change. That's the fallacy, so it is absolutely a fallacy even if you have an accurate conclusion to use a fallacious argument like, 'Well, no true vegan eats steak,' end quotes." There is, of course, a serious problem in McClellan's reasoning. He begins this statement with a red herring. It is indeed true that just because the conclusion to a fallacious argument is true doesn't mean that the argument itself is valid. However, that has no bearing upon whether the argument as presented is valid or not. McClellan then shifts to his real claim, which is that the addition of the word true makes the argument invalid because it introduces an arbitrary change to the boundaries of the claim. But what McClellan here fails to clarify is whose argument is the change being made. It is certainly not with the first premise that the boundaries are being changed. If anything, the addition of the word true to the final premise is reiterating the claim of the first premise. And if the parameters of Peter's rejoinder are being restricted by the addition of true to George's response, then that's not in any way arbitrary. McClellan keeps using the word arbitrary.
You keep using the word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Being arbitrary means to do something in a random, capricious, or unreasonable way. Insisting one sticks to the parameters of the first premise is not random, and it's not capricious, and it's certainly not unreasonable. It is thoroughly consistent with the definition presented in the first premise. But McClellan continues, quote, "This is not an accurate conclusion, because being vegan is a social identity, and this doesn't even scratch the surface of the complexity of social identities. Some people don't feel comfortable observing veganism around family or friends or colleagues or their bosses or something like that. They may feel that they need to perform the consumption of meat in certain circumstances. Some people struggle with it and they identify as vegan. And they try hard, but sometimes they are weak." End quote. McClellan here claims that being a vegan is a social identity, and by virtue of being imperfect or weak, one can be a vegan while eating meat. In essence, McClellan is arguing that identity is fluid and can mean whatever you want it to mean. Of course, that is a ridiculous redefinition of the term vegan, and it is a veiled appeal to the persuasion definition fallacy. However, we can demonstrate that adding true, real, or genuine does not make an argument automatically fallacious with a counterexample. Argument number 3. Jane says, "No U.S. Federal Reserve $3 bill is legal tender." Ken replies, "I print $3 bills and pass them off all the time." Jane responds, "But no U.S. Federal Reserve $3 bill is genuine legal tender." Here, in this argument, Jane is using the word genuine in the final premise, but in no sense is it being used in an arbitrary fashion that changes the meaning of the first premise. Jane has constrained the argument to only bills printed by the U.S. Federal Reserve, of which Ken is understood to not be affiliated with. It would be ridiculous to claim that Jane is being arbitrary by claiming that a $3 bill wasn't genuine. Jane's first premise is a generalization, but it is also a true generalization. And likewise, the final premise in no way changes the meaning of the first premise, but reaffirms the parameters set out in the first premise. Being that U.S. monetary notes are authorized and printed by the U.S. Federal Reserve, any note issued by the U.S. Federal Reserve must by necessity be a genuine legal tender note. So, if McClellan seriously thinks that something being true, real, or genuine is arbitrary, I would be more than willing to trade him a truckload of ridiculously fake monopoly money for the U.S. Federal Reserve denominational equivalent. This is just nothing but sloppy postmodern brain rot. Simply put, without the first premise containing a fallacy of relevance, this structure ceases to be fallacious. And without the fallacy of relevance, there is no moving the goalpost, and no true Scotsman fallacy. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting and learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.